The Education of the Gentleman by Richard M. Weaver. When in 1828 John Randolph of Roanoke, answering Edward Everett in the House of Representatives, called the ability to lead men, whether in the field or in the Senate chamber, the highest of the gifts of heaven, he was expressing the prevailing belief of his Southern compatriots. There is, he said, with the bitter implication of which he was a master, a class of men who possess great learning, combined with inveterate professional habits, and who are, ipso facto, or perhaps I should say ipsis factis, for I must speak accurately as I speak before a professor, disqualified for any but secondary parts anywhere, even in the cabinet. It was natural that a people whose talent lay almost wholly in the direction of statecraft should consider eminence in war and eloquence in council the marks of illustrious manhood. The Southerner of good class was Aristotle's political animal. His antecedents were auspicious for leadership. His education prepared him for it, and before the 19th century was, in its second quarter, the exigencies of his situation created a continuous demand for its exertion. Many explanations have been offered to account for the poor showing of the Old South in literature, but not enough has been said of the section's actual achievements in terms of its animating ideals. The climate, the lack of cities, the institution of slavery, all have been mentioned as militating against authorship, but inspection will reveal that the Old South wrote fairly prolifically, and that, in the field which it had marked out for its own, it held preeminence for close to a century. The Old South was an aristocracy whose hero was the warrior statesman, and because it was intensely interested in the battle for political supremacy, its literature was the literature of the forum. It is a maxim that in every society education will ultimately serve the needs of the dominant class, and in the South this consisted of gentlemen planters who contemplated lives of ease and independence. The plantation system, with its patriarchal administration and the presence of slavery, which drove a wedge between the leisure class and those compelled to toil for a living, kept at the top of society a small group whose immediate tasks called for duties of a political nature. The Southern planter, although his ancestors might have been tradesmen or yeomen, became, once he had perfected his material establishment in America, an aristocrat by calling, upon whom were devolved the work of keeping harmonious the efforts of a stratified and fairly complex community. The question of noble lineage, which usually gets much attention, becomes largely irrelevant when it is understood that once in the New World, these settlers created and maintained a class society. By the beginning of the 18th century, the populace was effectually divided into a lower class of slaves and tenants, a middle class of yeomen or small independent farmers, and an upper class of planters. The aristocracy of the Old South was small in number, and it was found in restricted areas, but such is the nature of aristocracy that if it is genuine, and that means if it earns and receives respect, its relative number is of little importance. It will set the tone of society, and those who aspire to rise in the world will seek to identify themselves with it. Though the number of antebellum mansions may soon be counted, it is none the less true that those who dwelled in them put their stamp upon the whole of Southern society, not excluding the turbulent frontier. Virginia, where this system lay in happiest balance, became the spearhead of the American Revolution and gave to the infant republic a wealth of leadership such as might have graced the golden age of another nation. The names of her sons comprise a veritable Plutarchian list of heroes. Patrick Henry, one of the most eloquent of Americans, and a man of prophetic vision. Washington, whose firm and sagacious mind prevented the collapse of the colonial rebellion. Jefferson, cosmopolitan and bold political thinker. Madison, political journalist and learned student of constitutional history; John Marshall, the legislative judge who carried far the fateful impulse toward consolidation; and John Taylor of Caroline, farmer philosopher whose searching critique of economic society anticipated the assumptions of Marxism. These were the chief figures in that constellation of genius which emerged from the agrarian, feudal society of colonial Virginia, and who, joined with the few from other states, confirmed the South in the habit of governing. Their comparative superiority invites attention to the system of education which prepared them. The Southern ideal of education rested on those traditional principles which may be traced to Aristotle by way of the Elizabethans. Because it was designed to produce the well-rounded gentleman, its basic features are fairly easy to distinguish. Education beyond the most elementary, it was believed, is adapted only to those whose minds are previously disposed to the virtuous and the honorable. In other words, to an aristocracy. It is not adapted to the masses, who appreciate only the utilitarian and who are condemned to lead lives of service. According to a writer discussing public education in the Southern Literary Messenger, to enlighten all classes most effectively, we should begin with the upper one first. Light should be set on a high place, so that it may dispel the darkness that surrounds us, and a few men truly and thoroughly educated would shed more light around them and awaken a desire for improvements in a greater number than in any other single way in which we could diffuse it. This diffusion, however, did not mean that equality was to be sought. There are many things in which the attempt to introduce the principles of equality must end in the complete deterioration of all parties concerned. God made the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser to rule the night, and this principle was through the whole of creation, and all attempts of man to subvert it must end, as they always have, in the manifest injury to all parties. In the same vein, a writer in Debau's Review had the following to say about common schools and universities. There are those, I am aware, whose chosen theme it is to declaim upon the democracy of science and literature in this favored age, and to undervalue all education and acquirements unless they be of popular character. To such I make no reply, further than to say, I believe it is self-evident that it is impossible, in the nature of things, for the multitude to attain more than a very superficial acquaintance with the various departments of learning and knowledge. None of you thus wished the Southern system of education to be devised in frank recognition of the section's caste system. William H. Trescott of South Carolina expressed this desire in the baldest fashion. In establishing, then, a system of education for a slave state, there are two principles which may be placed as a foundation on which to build. 1. That the state is not required to provide education for the great bulk of the laboring classes. 2. That it is required to afford that degree of education to every one of its white citizens which will enable him intelligently and actively to control and direct the slave labor of the state. Though the planters of Virginia occasionally made provision for the common school education of the lower orders in their community, it was thus generally thought that higher education was for those whose position in life carried a mandate for public leadership. This led the antebellum South to the anomalous situation in which the faculties for university training were more widespread and better developed than those for secondary school training. Archibald Roane, writing in Debau's Review, affirmed the Southern choice in this matter. If, then, one of the two systems of education, the common school or the university system, must prevail exclusively or even generally, and we have already shown that where the former is of the greatest excellence, it does not necessarily follow the latter two must be so, and even one may exist without the other. I repeat, if a choice between the two must be made, It seems to me that no man who has regard to the honor, reputation, and glory of his country, abroad and in future time, can hesitate to give preference to the university system. We, in the South at least, who have not been so much carried away by the crude and radical theories of the times, can have no such hesitation. The education which the South envisaged for its upper class was humanistic, and it was so framed as to instill the classic qualities of magnificence, magnanimity, and liberality. The virtues of a ruling caste depend upon the kind of training which molds character. Discussing the proposal to organize a central Southern university, at which the sons of the South would be taught the principles of their society, a writer in DeBow's Review set down the following as first consideration. In the organization of the university, this maxim should be borne in mind. Nothing is improper to be taught which is proper for a gentleman to learn. While proponents of education talked in general about enlarging the sentiments and developing the powers of the mind, the intimation remained plain that institutions of higher learning were expected to turn out a type, and that the basic aim of instruction was to teach propriety rather than to cultivate cleverness and ingenuity. This is significant as showing a tendency, for in proportion as a social system is rigid, it will set premium upon conformity to the accepted type and ignore those whose only birthright is ability. Such education was moral in the sense that it would give the youth a sound set of values. In accordance with the theory of the Greek thinker, it would teach one to approve and disapprove of the right objects in the right manner, or to display a set of correct sentiments determined by the code of the gentleman. In defense of the education of the planter class, a writer in Russell's Magazine maintained that, apart from professional exactness and professional details, they have the general scholarly training which so well becomes the gentleman, and is so necessary to the perfect development of his character. This was praised as liberal because it resulted in a catholicity of taste as well as of feeling, and an elevated view of all subjects, particularly public affairs. The student, declared a writer in DeBow's Review, must be regarded as a moral, as an intellectual, and as a physical being, and any system that does not provide for the proper development of each one of these departments, if the term be permitted, falls short of the requirements of his nature. This presumed a well-rounded regimen, which would leave him prepared, like Milton's scholar, to perform all general duties, both public and private, of peace and of war. The significant feature of this training was its avoidance of specialization. That this avoidance was deliberate, and that it derived from the premises, there can be no question. Since specialization is illiberal in a freeman, his acquaintance with the arts and sciences must remain that of the amateur. He must learn enough to be a judge of proficiency in others, but proficiency in himself is a sign of vulgarity. Nothing can be clearer than that the man who drew up the program of the Southern universities desired to produce neither bookish minds nor clever specialists. They were training young men for the Southern world, where scholarship was politely admired and then largely ignored. The students were fully alive to these purposes, and thus we find a youthful orator at the College of William and Mary in 1699, warning his institution against turning out the scholar type. For in such a retired corner of the world, far from business and action, if we make scholars, they are in danger of proving mere scholars, which make a very ridiculous figure, made up of pedantry, disputatiousness, positiveness, and a great many other ill qualities which render them not fit for action and conversation. In 1839, nearly a century and a half later, an article in the Southern Literary Messenger reflected an identical point of view. The writer declared, "Men who are endowed in any extraordinary manner with one talent are generally unfit for any other purpose in life. They take no interest in the ordinary affairs of society, are lost to all notions of prudence or considerations of the useful. Everything is sacrificed to the indulgence of the one ruling passion. It is well, we say, that society is not made up of such men, but that it consists of those who have no very great capacity for one pursuit more than another, and who possess all the faculties in a moderate degree. King Philip's famous taunt to his son Alexander, who had performed skillfully upon the flute, "Are you not ashamed, son, to play so well?" would have been understood in the antebellum South. The thought of devoting oneself to learning for its own sake did not appeal to the ruling class. Allowing for the great attention paid to the study of law, one may say that Southerners, like the English, whom they imitated, wanted to be the head of affairs, not professionals, but competent amateurs. Training for leadership there was, of course, as has been noted, but when the training has been scrutinized, it turns out to be such as in another age would have produced the courtier, with special attention given to rhetoric. So great was the value set upon the spoken word that at the University of Georgia, forensic disputation was a required course, and the testimonials proving the Southern College youth's anticipation of a future in politics are numberless. The attitude of the Old South toward education, and in a parallel way toward the arts, cannot be understood until it is realized that the propertied classes regarded their roles in life as fixed, and that academic training was expected to prepare their sons to play their parts as leaders in the little plantation world, or perhaps in the state or national legislature, with skill and credit. That many who entered life without possession received this training does not diminish the force of the assertion, for they were regarded as, in a sense, probationers, who, in the course of a career of the approved type, would be assimilated into this class. Professionalism and specialization, except in the law, were for those unlucky enough to have to make their living by them. It is axiomatic that in any society self-made men will imitate those for whom greatness is a birthright. This explains the tremendous pressure to conform to the gentleman type. The sons of yeomen who passed by way of education and success at law into the upper ranks of society, and there were many such, must have felt doubly obligated to accept the point of view of the group in which they were parvenus. The gentleman's ideal of behavior has been in all periods the same. He is a self-justifying type who feels that he does not have to earn his position by special exertions. That is to say, his importance lies not in what he can do, but in what he is. The gentleman expresses an end in himself, and the display of skills, powers, and cleverness alone does not gain one admission to his circle. These are things needed by those who have not yet arrived in the world. Their exhibition a sign that the possessor is still in process of becoming. The gentleman, on the other hand, is heir to the aristocratic knowledge that he owes his place to the structure of society, and not to anything that he can do especially well. There is a persisting belief that to make a man a specialist is somehow to interfere with his performance as a whole man. The career of a gentleman is being a gentleman. The social and educational regimen of the Old South was accordingly such as to prepare the fortunate for public life, to produce men of integrity and decision, who could talk well and wear the graces, not quill drivers or career men of letters or explorers of the scientific world. The comparative absence of imaginative literature in the South must be largely explained by the traditional aristocratic contempt for the artist as specialist. The classic expression of this attitude comes from Hotspur, the beau sabreur of a society not unlike that of the antebellum South. "I'd rather be a kitten and cry mew than one of the same meter ballad mongers." In such a milieu, literature is looked upon as an elegant indulgence, pardonable in those who use it as an entertainment for their leisure, reprehensible in those who pursue it to the extent of neglecting personal or public cares. Where war and statecraft are held the chief offices of man, preoccupation with an art will be regarded as a sentimental weakness. The talent which went into the orations of Patrick Henry, the journalism of Madison, the state papers of Jefferson, and the political economy of John Taylor was unquestionably of a high order, but it was confined to one field. The endeavors which elsewhere produced imaginative treatments of the human scene, or, as in New England, theocratic disputes and transcendentalist philosophies, in the South flowered in political classics. Jefferson, the apostle of liberty, after stating the grounds for American independence, wrote a series of state papers and political speculations, which may well be regarded as the most seminal in our history. Henry, political seer, predicted in his three most celebrated orations the division of church and state, the separation of the colonies from the mother country, and the then far off war between the states. Madison, erudite student of history, joined with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay to write the authoritative exposition of the nature of the Union. And John Taylor of Caroline, an unpretending country gentleman, turned like Cincinnatus from the plow to the concerns of his country, and presented the case for agrarian civilization in his formidable An Inquiry into the Principles and Policies of the Government of the United States, a work which one qualified student has described as worthy to rank with the 2 or 3 really historic contributions to political science which have been produced in this country. While the South continued to enjoy the political and social leadership which these denote, while her institutions were yet unchallenged, her literary sterility, though often admitted, was not seriously deplored. In 1820, however, the Missouri Compromise sharply dramatized the growing sectional hostility, and thereafter the South considered it a reproach to herself to remain the literary pupil of the North. Sectionalism in politics had now fully emerged, and it was to be followed by a Southern effort to express a regional culture. From this time on, repeated attempts were made to establish journals, which should be vehicles of Southern learning and present the Southern point of view on topics of general interest. The Southern Review of Charleston was the first solid achievement in this direction, and although it attained a standard of real excellence and appears today the most characteristically Southern of all that were attempted, it endured only from 1828 to 1832. 2 years after its cessation, however, a Richmond printer, Thomas Willies White, founded the Southern Literary Messenger, which, despite faltering first steps, was destined to be a mouthpiece of Southern culture for 30 years, and to come nearer than any other medium to giving the Southland that literary independence which was being sought. The first issue of this distinguished journal, appearing in August 1834, carried an editorial which is a summing up of much that has been here pointed out. It is folly to boast of political ascendancy, of moral influence, of professional eminence, or unrivaled oratory, when, in all the Corinthian graces which adorn the structure of the mind, we are lamentably deficient. It is worse than folly to talk of this ancient and unterrified commonwealth, if we suffer ourselves to be terrified at the idea of supporting one poor periodical devoted to letters and mental improvement. The issue carried also a list of letters from correspondents, saluting its appearance. Their general tone reflects a resentment of Northern intellectual hegemony and a hope that the South would accept the opportunity to express itself on topics other than politics. Said one correspondent, "With these sentiments you may be assured that I wish success to your endeavor to rouse the spirit of the South in the cause of literature, to draw its intellectual energies from the everlasting and monotonous discussion of politics, which has run the same round of arguments and topics for 40 years, and allure her favored sons and daughters to the kinder and brighter fields of science and letters." Another wrote, I look with much anxiety at your launch, which I wish had been the title of your work, the first of any promise in Virginia, heartily desiring it Godspeed, yet fearing that you may meet with some inaptitude or distaste to mere literary contribution from the educated of our citizens. This, however, cannot last long. You may feel it at the outset, but it will soon end, for I doubt not that the messenger, as one of its best effects, will draw into literary exercise the talents which now lie fallow throughout the community, or which have long extravasated in politics or professions. A third likewise found reason to hope that it would create an appetite for literary fame and thus diminish the obsession with politics. We have been too long tributary to the North. It is time, high time, to awake from our lethargy, to rise to the majesty of our intellectual strength, put on the panoply of talents and genius, and strike for the prize of our high calling. If the object of your labors be attained, of which there can be no reasonable doubt, posterity will be more grateful to you than to thousands of political exquisites of the day, whose memory will last only so long as their ephemeral production. Despite a degree of outward success, however, it is plain that the messenger had to contend with much apathy and indifference in its regional constituency. Thus, in 1853, 9 years after the hopeful beginning just described, one finds the editor exclaiming, "How glad to us will be the day when an ardent love of liberal learning shall have supplanted some of the hobbies of Southern intellect, have roused its slumbering energies, and imparted a taste for purest joys and sweetest solaces." By 1857, it appeared that some progress had been made against the universal preoccupation with politics, and the editor could exult in the newfound glory of authors. The literary men are regarded with greater consideration than formerly, and are not now compelled to walk under the huge legs of politicians and peep about to find themselves dishonorable graves. It is getting to be thought that a man may, perhaps, accomplish as much for the South by writing a good book as by making a successful stump speech, that he who contributes to the enjoyment of his fellow citizens by a lofty poem, or shapes their convictions by a powerful essay, is not an idle dreamer merely, and that the pen devoted to the treatment of subjects out of the range of political and commercial activities is as usefully employed as the tongue which is exercised in the wearisome declamation of legislative halls. Such spells of enthusiasm were usually short-lived, for expectations were dashed. 2 years later, in connection with a pointless debate then going on in Charleston over whether William Gilmore Simms could write good English prose, there appeared this characteristic note of exasperation: when will the people of the South learn to know and honor their worthiest literary men? The last of such ventures was Russell's Magazine, which commenced in 1857 under the sponsorship of Timrod, Hayne, and others. An editorial in the second issue reflected the sense of cultural isolation. Year after year, under the influence of foreign pressure and outrage, the Southern states have been drawing closer the bonds of a common brotherhood and developing in self-reliance, energy, courage, and all the resources of independent nationality. They are rapidly aspiring to the station which God designed that they should occupy and adorn. Ironically, at the very time when the South declared its literary independence of the North, Southern authors found it imperative to give a larger share of their intellectual energies to the political struggle. The quarrel over the tariff, the nullification movement, and the beginning of incendiary attacks on slavery put the section squarely on the defensive, with the result that in the period of 1829 to 1835, the abler leaders of the South definitely abandoned democracy. From this time on, mounting political zeal deflected creative spirits from complete dedication to literature and also altered for the worse the South's contributions to political thought, heretofore its chief claim to intellectual distinction. The speculations of Henry, Jefferson, Mason, Madison, R. H. Lee, and Taylor may be called philosophic in a real sense of the word. Resting on assumptions furnished by the French Enlightenment, they deal with the broad topic of man and society and discuss principles certain to assert themselves wherever there is free political organization. After the South had been warned to look for destructive attacks on her institutions, both temper and point of view shifted. Her writings became devoted, on the one hand, to an exposition of propositions already crystallized in law, and, on the other, to a demonstration of the humanitarian aspects of slavery. The real question was begged. It was now not how might the South best define the legal status of the African for the benefit of the general polity, but what would be the most effective propaganda to counter the stream flowing down from the North? The first question had been uppermost in many minds before hatred clouded the picture, but in the 4 decades preceding the war, dispassionate opinion practically vanished. One is able to appreciate the intensity of the feeling which was generated when he learns that it drove into sectional consciousness such detached and cosmopolitan intelligences as Thomas Jefferson and Edgar A. Poe. In this connection, John C. Calhoun may be studied as a bridge between the old and the new schools of Southern political thought. Born of up-country yeoman stock, he was of undistinguished origin, but through law and marriage into a family of position, he took the sure road to the top of the social hierarchy. Unlike the typical Southerner in his ascetic habits and humorless disposition, Calhoun made a lasting contribution to the political literature of his section, if not indeed to the science of politics, with his doctrine of the concurrent majority, an attempt to fix a procedure whereby in any commonwealth the minority may check the tyranny of the majority. The intellectual resourcefulness indicated by this ingenious theory must place him among the foremost American political thinkers, but at the same time it was so plainly a rationalization of sectional needs that he appears the forerunner of the Southern apologists in his dream of Greek democracy, part of the Southern defensive reaction. This reaction was twofold. It comprised in part an attack on the libertarian dogmas of the French Revolution, and in part a new theory of social articulation. The leading exponents of this theory, who became quite vocal after 1830, reveal a noteworthy unity of belief. Among them was Thomas R. Dew, a Virginian, who studied in Germany during the era of Fichte and Hegel, and returned home to teach at William and Mary, filled with the notion that duties are more important than rights. Called upon to testify before a legislative committee, he dismissed Jefferson's theories as glittering generalities, stated in substance the iron law of wages, and maintained that all great civilizations are built on the toil of subject peoples. Another was Chancellor William Harper of South Carolina, who in 1837 published a memoir on slavery. He took the position that those who control property will always rule, that society has a variety of offices which must be performed by human beings of different castes, and that education should be given in accordance with the recipient's role in life. Is it not palpably nearer the truth, he asked, in an examination of the axiom that all men are created free and equal, to say that no man was ever born free, and that no two men were ever born equal? Man is born to subjection, he reasoned, just as he is born in sin and ignorance. The most striking contribution to this body of thought, however, was George Fitzhugh's Sociology for the South, published in 1854. This work is unique in the boldness of its attack on the theory of free society and in its remarkable foreshadowing of the modern corporate state. Fitzhugh argued that competitive society throws the burden on the weak and the ignorant, whose toil goes to swell the vulgar pomp and pageantry of ignorant millionaires, and that therefore the entire world should return to slavery, for slavery is a form, and the very best form, of socialism. Private property should be preserved because its possession tends to beget learning, skill, and high moral qualifications. But liberty is a delusion, since all virtue lies in the performance of duty. Though not without misstatements and exaggerations, the book is an outline of the totalitarian state, which substitutes for individual liberty and free competition a fixed hierarchy and state provision for all classes, and it shows how far out of the main current of 19th century thought the Southern apologists had moved in order to defend their inherited system. An impulse capable of driving political philosophers so far to the right could not fail to be reflected in general literature. The desire for the South for literary fame, never of hardy growth, thrusting up in spite of tendencies of education and social pressure, now had to encounter a gathering political hurricane. We have seen that at the time when the South embarked upon literary independence, it embarked also upon militant sectionalism. If previously the pursuit of belles lettres had been viewed as an amiable frivolity, it might, after the South had commenced its bitter ideological struggle with the North, be regarded as nothing less than reminiscence in duty. The prevailing notion had always been that a man of parts should serve the state, even in times of peace. Opposed to the effort of a few progressive spirits to win the Southern intellectual away from politics, there must be noted the tendency, strong and pervasive especially among the popular element, to demand of him some form of public service. Thus the gallant Philip Pendleton Cook, circumstanced as few were in his time to cultivate the muse, had the following illuminating incident to report. What do you think of a good friend of mine, a most valuable and worthy and hard-riding one, saying gravely to me a short time ago, I wouldn't waste time on a damned thing like poetry. You might make yourself, with all your sense and judgment, a useful man in settling neighborhood disputes and difficulties. Cook himself was, to some extent, tinctured with the same attitude. Literature he regarded as an occupation for the middle years. Thereafter, age and gravity called for statecraft. My literary life opens now, he wrote to a friend. If the world manifest any disposition to hear my utterances, it will be abundantly gratified. I am 30. Until I am 40, literature shall be my calling, avoiding, however, to rely on it pecuniarily. Then, after 40, politics will be a sequitur. Richard Henry Wilde, whose delicate faculty gave the world My life is like the summer rose, drew censure for choosing to spend years studying the legend and romance of medieval Italy. The mission to which Mr. Wilde addressed his faculties and gave years to toil in Europe, wrote a chronicler of the bench and bar of Georgia, was not in harmony with his relative duties to mankind and with that position which his eminent talents and finished cultivation had secured from the world. He was qualified for extensive practical usefulness as a jurist, scholar, and statesman. In Europe there was delight to the senses, but mildew to the heart. The voluptuary, the man of fashion, the idler were gratified, but the moral hero, the public benefactor, the man of enterprise, and the scholar of a just ambition, desirous to leave a record of popular utility, would turn the generous self-denial from such enchantments. This critic could not understand how Wilde could devote years of study to Tasso, to the sentimental details, to the fantasies of insanity, and that, too, not for the benefit of medical jurisprudence. In short, the task, with whatever success performed by Mr. Wilde, was below the merit which should have sustained itself in a better field, at the forum, in the walks of political economy, in commerce, in constitutional law, or in the analysis of government, all of which admitted the classic beauties of style. The scholar of a just ambition is an especially meaningful phrase. By it, the writer was pointing to the student of public affairs, whose research and mediation may be counted on to promote the interests of society, not to add to self-culture or to further art for art's sake. As John Donald Wade has remarked, antebellum Georgia considered all activity of the latter kind dilettantism. Occasionally, this attitude took the form of direct patriotic appeal to Southerners of a reflective cast of mind to produce a Southern philosophy. From the Bible and Aristotle, stated a writer in DeBow's review, we can deduce, added to our own successful experiment, quite enough to build a new philosophy on the ruins of the present false and vicious system. The urgency of the time required a Southern transvaluation of values. Hence it follows that all books in the whole range of moral science, if not written by Southern authors within the last 20 or 30 years, inculcate abolition either directly or indirectly. If written before that time, even by Southern authors, they are likely to be as absurd and dangerous as the Declaration of Independence or the Virginia Bill of Rights. In an environment where insistent denigration of artistic interest was reinforced by overmastering temptation to enter the political debate, there was no room for belles lettres as a profession. Rewards waited upon other forms of activity, and most of those who, in the heat and imagination of youth, tried poetry and fiction, gave them up for good, or for long intervals, either to take up political journalism or to become men of affairs. The gifted man of letters swallowed up in the lawyer is one of the common figures of the Old South. William Wirt, whose Letters of a British Spy and The Old Bachelor reveal a talent for the genial essay, became Attorney General for the United States, and gave to office that energy which might have made him conspicuous in literature, as was noted by a contemporary biographer. John Pendleton Kennedy, the friend and benefactor of Poe, after producing in Swallow Barn one of the idols of American literature, a work which for charm and deftness is not surpassed by the best of Irving, closed a long period of dilettante activity by sinking into the complacent functionary and businessman. The career of Nathaniel Beverly Tucker, however, provides perhaps the best example of how Southern men of literary endowment were won from pure literature by the challenge of the sectional political contest. Born at Mattoax, to a family rich in traditions of service to the state, Tucker graduated from the College of William and Mary, spent a period practicing law in Missouri, and then returned to his alma mater as professor. In 1834, he published George Balcom, a novel described by Poe as the best America had to that time produced. 2 years later appeared The Partisan Leader, a remarkable forecast of sectional conflict issued under the date 1856, in the hope that it would prove a warning to Virginians. The Partisan Leader is a prime instance of a novel with a specific political purpose. One beholds in this story, with its long disputes over tariffs and other topics of sectional rivalry, the absorbing political strife which was soon to engulf its author completely. A vehement advocate of state rights and the agrarian order, Tucker accepted the gauge which he felt had been thrown down by the North and poured forth a stream of political treatises, but in doing so he silenced one more literary voice for the South. The career of William Gilmore Simms demands special appraisal, for it is peculiarly instructive in the fascination which the Southern social order exercised upon men of strong and independent mind, even while it tormented them with frustration. Simms was the nearest approach to the professional man of letters to be found in the antebellum South, with the possible exceptions of Poe and Mason Locke Weems. Born outside of the aristocratic class, he made a determined effort to gain entry into it by means of his pen, and if an indefatigable industry and allegiance to the principles of his society had been the measure of success, he would have reached the top. For several years, he deserted romance, in which his achievement had been best recognized, to attempt biography, history, and oratory, securing with his The Morals of Slavery a place alongside Chancellor Harper and Governor J.H. Hammond in pro slavery arguments. In 1849, he assumed the unrewarding editorship of the Southern Quarterly Review, with the object of giving the South an organ comparable to New England's North American Review. It was not to be. His considerable exertions in defense of the Southern feudal order did not get him admitted to the magic circle. He discovered that in this milieu, proficiency in letters, even loyal service to the regime, was no substitute for property holding or family connections. In Charleston, if anywhere, aristocratic disdain for the mere littérature was decisive, and no conceivable fame in the field of his choice would have been weighed in the scale with the successes of others in camp and senate. Although by some miracle of affection Sims remained a loyal Charlestonian to the end, he could not refrain in moments of despondency from recognizing that celebrated city's indifference to his work. On October 30th, 1858, he wrote in a personal memorandum, 30-odd years have passed, and I can now mournfully say that the old man, his father, was right. All that I have done has been poured to waste in Charleston, which has never smiled on any of my labors, which has steadily ignored my claims, which has disparaged me to the last, has been the last place to give me its adhesion, to which I owe no favor, having never received an office, or a compliment, or a dollar at her hands, and with the exception of some dozen of her citizens, who have been kind to me, and some scores of her young men, who have honored me with loving sympathy and something like reverence, which has always treated me like a public enemy to be sneered at, than a dutiful son doing her honor. A passage in his poem, The Western Immigrants, has been taken as reflecting the same feeling. Simple change of place is seldom exile, as it hath been called, but idly. There is a truer banishment to which such faith were gentle. 'Tis to be an exile on the spot where you were born, a stranger to the hearth which saw your youth, banished from hearts to which your heart is turned. This, together with his famous self-composed epitaph, here lies one who, after a reasonably long life distinguished chiefly by unceasing labors, has left all his better work undone, is a poignant testimony of defeat. This tragedy of Sims's entire career was that he expected something which this society was not prepared to give, and that in the struggle he sacrificed too much. As compromises are usually fatal, little doubt exists that the concessions he was compelled to make to be effective as a man account for his relative mediocrity as poet and romancer. The antebellum Southern humorists, who will be remembered as the creators of an indigenous American literature, exhibit the same drift from art to politics. Augustus Baldwin Longstreet, who, with Georgia Scenes, began the rich tradition of frontier humor, spoke apologetically of his volume as a mere bagatelle, and soothed his conscience by hoping that the sketches would one day be valuable as history. Later in life, having gained place and respectability, he plunged into the pro-slavery argument with Letters on the Epistle of Paul to Philemon, or The Connection of Apostolic Christianity with Slavery, and A Voice from the South. Joseph Glover Baldwin, a genius at the comic, followed up his entertaining The Flush Times of Alabama and Mississippi, not with more writing of the imaginative kind, which the popularity of this work should have encouraged, but with Party Leaders, a series of political portraits of men such as Hamilton, Jefferson, and Clay. An aristocracy, if it is rich and secure, will foster the arts by means of patronage and largesse, but it does not assimilate the artist. It continues to regard him qua artist. He is, after all, an entertainer. If, on the other hand, the aristocracy is menaced, it will gird itself for battle, and the artist, who in calmer times was its charge, will suffer neglect and perhaps contumely. The dominant society of the Old South was an aristocracy, imperfect but in process of perfecting itself. Its position, however, was remarkably precarious. It was threatened flank and rear. From the north came attack on its labor system, which, as everyone recognized, was the kingpin of the whole southern economy. From the west came the incessant pressure of the frontier, with its natural equalitarianism. Defense against these powerful forces demanded that things be kept in battle order. Ranks had to be closed, allegiance made firm. In the light of these circumstances, one understands why the young Southerner was educated to be a political soldier. He was the heir apparent of a civilization which rested on principles antedating the French Revolution. While New England in her golden day was softening down Calvinism into Unitarianism, the Southern intellectuals were busy building up a rigid theology to defend a social order, with which their fortunes stood or fell. The concentration upon this task, which began with academic education, continued with maturity, and flowered, as often it did, in a manifesto bearing the fruits of conscientious research and meditation, left little room for the more disinterested kind of creativeness. To many of them, literary aspiration appeared a thing of guilt. Pleasure was there, duty was here. They cultivated literature in odd hours and then left it for sterner enjoyments. Since every system of education is ultimately a tool of the state, the controlling point of view will be that which the state visualizes as its chief source of welfare. In one society, it may be commercial skill, in another, science and invention. In the Old South, it was an ad hoc humanism, which produced the gentleman scholar and the political soldier. When one considers this education and this temperament, it comes as no surprise that in the era following Appomattox, many Southerners felt impelled to re-enter the Forum. Nearly all of them believed that the various Northern statesmen on the origin of the war rested not only upon misinterpretations of the Constitutional Compact, a phrase dear to Southerners of legal training, but also upon shallow and sophistical theories of society. It was a matter of proclaiming justice among the ruins, but the powerful polemic vein which had run from Patrick Henry to Calhoun and Yancey continued in appreciable volume for more than 15 years after the collapse of the Confederacy. A later chapter will discuss the pivotal ideas with which the apologists of the lost cause sought at least the consolation of a forensic victory.